By 1961, organized crime in the United States had already evolved into a national system of power, with families operating across cities but tied together through shared interests, alliances, and discipline. The commission structure was firmly in place, and bosses from New York, Buffalo, Chicago, and beyond understood that stability meant profit. Yet beneath that structure, pressure was building. From law enforcement, from internal disputes, and from a growing fear that secrecy itself was beginning to crack. In Kansas City, that pressure surfaced through a federal investigation that exposed years of quiet cooperation between organized crime figures and local police officials. A grand jury found evidence that officers had routinely ignored illegal gambling operations, warned mob figures about raids, and allowed rackets to operate without interference. This was not isolated corruption, but a system that had developed over decades, where crime and enforcement existed side by side. The exposure of that relationship forced federal authorities to reconsider how deeply organized crime had embedded itself within American institutions. In New York, another shift occurred, less visible, but equally significant. On June 20th, Frank Costello was released from prison after serving nearly a year on Rikers Island. Once one of the most powerful figures in the mafia, Costello had already stepped back following the assassination attempt ordered by Vito Genovese in 1957. His release confirmed what many already understood: he would not return to leadership. Instead, he withdrew into a quieter role, focusing on gambling and legitimate business interests, leaving the Genovese family fully under new control. His absence removed a stabilizing figure, one who had relied on political influence rather than violence, and his departure marked a shift toward more aggressive leadership within the underworld. In Boston, violence continued to unfold in the early stages of what would later be known as the Irish Mob Wars. On October 31st, Bernard McLaughlin, a leader within the Charlestown faction, was murdered. His death came during a period of escalating conflict between Charlestown crews and the Somerville-based group that would later become the Winter Hill Gang. Control of gambling, loan sharking, and neighborhood influence drove the conflict, and McLaughlin's killing weakened Charlestown's position significantly. Responsibility for the murder was disputed. Some sources pointed to the Somerville crew, while others suggested involvement from the Patriarca crime family, which had its own interest in maintaining order in Boston. Regardless of who carried it out, the killing intensified the violence and set the stage for years of retaliation and consolidation. The most brutal and consequential event of 1961 unfolded in upstate New York, tied directly to the heroin trade that connected North America to Europe through what would later be called the French Connection. Albert Aguesi, a trafficker working within the Buffalo crime family's network, had been arrested and expected assistance from boss Stefano Magaddino. When that support failed to materialize, Aguesi began expressing frustration openly. In an organization built on silence and loyalty, even the suggestion of dissatisfaction raised suspicion. The fear was not what he had done, but what he might do next. On October 8th, Aguesi was abducted. What followed was not an execution, but a prolonged act of torture designed to send a message beyond the individual. He was held for weeks, during which time he was beaten repeatedly, his teeth knocked out, his hands bound, and sections of flesh cut from his body while he was still alive. The violence was deliberate and methodical, intended to reinforce the consequences of disloyalty. When his remains were discovered on November 23rd in a field near Rochester, the condition of the body confirmed the purpose of the act. It was not just punishment, but a warning to others within the network. The aftermath of Aguesi's death extended far beyond Buffalo. His brother, Vito Aguesi, began spreading rumors that Joe Valachi, a known associate within the heroin trade, had been cooperating with authorities. In the mafia, suspicion alone could trigger action. Vito Genovese, already concerned about informants, took the claim seriously and ordered that Valachi be killed. While in prison, Valachi believed that another inmate had been sent to carry out the order. Acting on that belief, he killed the man first. That moment set in motion one of the most important developments in organized crime history. Fearing for his life, Valachi agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. His eventual testimony in 1963 would become the first public explanation of the mafia's structure in the United States. He described the hierarchy, the code of silence, and the national network that had operated in secrecy for decades. The chain of events that led to that testimony began with the torture and murder of Albert Aguichi, turning a single internal dispute into a national turning point. Elsewhere, violence continued in quieter forms. Albert Tester, a counterfeiter and burglar connected to organized theft operations, was murdered during the year. His death was tied to ongoing disputes within criminal circles linked to larger organizations such as the Chicago Outfit. While less visible than other killings, it reflected the same internal enforcement system, disagreements settled through elimination, often without public attention or resolution. Across the country, these events formed a pattern. Organized crime remained powerful, but it was no longer insulated. Federal investigations were increasing, internal loyalty was weakening, and the first signs of exposure were beginning to appear. The system that had relied on silence and discipline was starting to show fractures, not from outside pressure alone, but from within its own ranks. By the end of 1961, the structure of the mafia still stood intact, but the foundation had shifted. Violence had become more visible, alliances more fragile, and suspicion more common. The events of that year did not bring immediate collapse, but they marked the beginning of a transition. From a hidden network of power to an organization that would soon face public scrutiny and internal betrayal. By 1962, organized crime was no longer just a collection of local rackets protected by silence and neighborhood fear. It was a national and international system under stress. The old bosses were dying, the younger ones were moving faster, narcotics cases were reaching deeper into family structures, and in Sicily, the post-war mafia was starting to split into openly hostile factions. This was the year when several old names exited the stage. Several newer ones made their move, and some of the violence that had been building in the late 1950s finally began to show its full shape. One of the first major deaths of the year was Lucky Luciano. By 1962, Luciano was no longer the day-to-day power he had once been, but he still stood as the most famous figure in American organized crime. He had helped reorganize the mafia after the Castellamarese War, helped shape the commission structure, and represented the model of a national syndicate rather than a loose collection of local bosses. On January 26th, he died in Naples while meeting with film producers about a movie based on his life. His death closed the life of the man most associated with the modern American mafia system. Even though he had been deported years earlier, his shadow still sat over every family in New York, and over every later boss who operated inside the structure he helped build. A few months later, another New York figure disappeared from the board under far murkier circumstances. Anthony "Tony Bender" Strollo vanished on April 8th. Strollo was not a celebrity boss in the public sense, but inside organized crime, he had been a major Genovese family operator, a former Maranzano lieutenant, and a long-established power in Greenwich Village gambling and street operations. By 1962, Vito Genovese was already deep in legal trouble, and internal mistrust was growing around him. In that climate, Strollo's disappearance fit the pattern of internal mafia discipline, a man removed without a public body, without testimony, and without resolution. In mob history, those disappearances were often as meaningful as open executions, because they showed that the system still preferred silence where it could. Then in June came the death of Joe Profaci. Profaci had built one of New York's 5 families and ruled it through old world authority, family connections, tribute demands, and rigid control. But by the time he died of cancer on June 6th, his family was already in revolt. The Gallo brothers and their faction had been fighting the Profasi leadership in what became the Gallo-Profasi War, and his death did not settle that conflict. Instead, it passed the problem forward to Joseph Magliocco. Profasi's death was part of a larger transition underway in the early 1960s. The old bosses who ruled through static hierarchy were dying or being sidelined, while younger factions that were more impatient, more violent, and more willing to challenge family leadership were testing the structure from below. 1962 also brought a quieter but important ending in Philadelphia with the death of Salvatore Sabella. Sabella was not a new era figure. He belonged to the earlier Castellamarese generation. Born in Sicily in 1891, he came up through violence early, emigrated to the United States, joined Salvatore Daccola's orbit in New York, and was then sent to Philadelphia in 1919 to build a Castellamarese Sicilian organization there. As cover, he ran food and drink businesses, but his real role was to organize and protect what would become the Philadelphia family. He trained later figures such as John Avena and Angelo Bruno, was deported after a murder case in the 1920s, returned during the Castellamarese War to back Maranzano, and then stepped away from organized crime in 1931. By 1962, when he died of natural causes, Sabella was no longer a current power. But his importance was historical. He belonged to the foundation period of Philadelphia organized crime, and his death marked the passing of one of the men who had helped transplant the Sicilian model into that city's underworld. On the West Coast, a different kind of ending came for Simone Scozzari. Scozzari was a Sicilian-born mobster who became a Los Angeles family soldier and later rose to underboss under Frank DeSimone. He had entered the United States illegally, settled in Southern California, built up bookmaking and club interests, and had enough standing to travel across the country with DeSimone to the Appalachin meeting in 1957. That meeting was the great public exposure of the national mafia, and it brought federal scrutiny down on men who otherwise might have stayed invisible. Scozzari was caught in that aftershock. He fought deportation for years, but on June 13, 1962, he was finally forced out of the country and sent back to Italy. In practical terms, this was not just an immigration story. It showed how Appalachin kept producing consequences years later. Men who had once operated as if they were untouchable were now being chipped away through tax law, deportation law, and federal procedure rather than just through homicide prosecutions. Inside prison walls, the year also gave a preview of what was coming with Joe Valachi. On June 21st, Valachi fatally assaulted fellow inmate John Sorp at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in a case of mistaken identity. Valachi believed he was under murder order and struck first. At the time, he was still a loyal mafia man under pressure, not yet the public witness he would become. But this killing showed the state he was in, isolated, terrified, and convinced that Genovese wanted him dead. The importance of this moment only became clear later. Valachi's fear, his prison violence, and his sense that the code no longer protected him all pushed him toward the break that would come next year. When he began explaining La Cosa Nostra in public terms, the government had never heard from an insider before. The biggest narcotics development, tied to a major American mob figure in 1962, involved Carmine Galante. Galante was one of the most direct and aggressive narcotics men in the Bonanno family, a man who had long been tied by law enforcement to heroin importation and enforcement work. He had already been indicted before, and one narcotics trial had collapsed into mistrial in 1961 after courtroom chaos and juror problems. But the government kept coming at the same network. On July 10, 1962, after conviction in his second narcotics trial, Carmine was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison and fined $20,000. The broader case was the federal heroin conspiracy case that also involved William Bentvena and others, tied to large-scale smuggling. The legal trail behind that sentence ran through his earlier fugitive arrest in New Jersey in 1959, his later surrender on another narcotics indictment in 1960, the failed first trial, and then the second successful prosecution. So when people talk about Galante getting arrested in 1962, the fuller historical answer is that 1962 was the year he was sentenced hard in the federal narcotics case after a longer sequence of indictments, arrests, and retrials tied to international heroin trafficking centered in New York. At the same time, the overseas side of the mafia world was moving toward open war. This is where names like Angelo La Barbera and Michele Cavataio have to be explained properly because they were not background figures. Angelo La Barbera was one of the most aggressive members of a younger Sicilian mafia generation in Palermo. He and his brother Salvatore came out of poverty, rose through theft, murder, construction deals, cigarette smuggling, and heroin traffic, and turned the Palermo Centro family into one of the most forceful and visible powers in the city. Angelo lived loudly for a mafioso of that period. He built a reputation for style, money, contacts, and speed. He was part gangster, part post-war entrepreneur, and part symbol of the new mafia that was trying to move beyond older rural-style leadership into urban rackets tied to construction, black market trade, and the heroin business that touched North America. The La Barbera brothers had also run into conflict with the Sicilian Mafia Commission. The commission had been created in part to manage disputes and prevent exactly the kind of spiraling violence that was now approaching. But the La Barberas were difficult to restrain. Complaints had already been raised against them over business practices and authority, and Angelo in particular resisted commission discipline. That matters because by late 1962, the heroin trade, local Palermo rackets, and personal hostilities all came together in one dispute. An underweight heroin shipment set off accusations between major Sicilian factions. The shipment had been financed by Cesare Manzella, the Grecos, and the La Barbera side. Suspicion fell on Calcedonio di Pisa, the mobster who had collected the heroin and arranged transport toward New York. That dispute went before the commission, but no clean resolution followed. This is where Michele Cavataio enters the story as a central operator rather than just another name. Michele was a Palermo boss from the Acquasanta area, known as the Cobra. He came up after the war through stolen fuel, dockside power, wholesale market rackets, and calculated violence. He was viewed as part of a newer, more aggressive mafia current, but unlike the La Barberas, he was less flamboyant and more manipulative. Later accounts, especially those of Tommaso Buscetta, identified Cavataio as the man who deliberately drove the factions toward war. According to that reconstruction, Cavataio killed Di Pisa while making it appear that the La Barberas were responsible, knowing the Greco side would blame them. In other words, he did not simply take part in the First Mafia War. He helped engineer the conditions for it by using one murder to turn suspicion into retaliation. Calcedonio di Pisa was shot to death on December 26, 1962, in Palermo. His murder is generally treated as the trigger point for the First Mafia War. After that, the conflict between the Greco-aligned side and the La Barbera-aligned side moved into a more openly violent phase, with bombings and killings that would carry into 1963. What had begun as a narcotics dispute tied to an underweight shipment became a broader struggle over the Palermo underworld, building contracts, market control, and access to heroin routes linked to the United States. So when 1962 organized crime is discussed only in American terms, part of the picture gets missed. The Sicilian War that broke open at the end of that year directly touched the same heroin economy that men like Galante were fighting over in New York. Taken as a whole, 1962 was a year of transition and exposure. Luciano died, Profaci died, Strollo disappeared. Sabella, a man from an earlier foundation period, died quietly. Scazzari was deported, showing the long reach of the Appalachian fallout. Velati moved one step closer to becoming the government's first true mafia insider. Galante took a major federal narcotics sentence. And in Sicily, Cavataio, Di Pisa, and Angelo La Barbera were now tied to the dispute that opened the First Mafia War. The year did not end the mafia. It tightened the pressure around it and pushed several of its hidden conflicts into forms that could no longer be managed quietly. You're watching the Everything Network. By 1963, organized crime was no longer operating in separate shadows. The system had become visible, not just to law enforcement, but to entire governments. In Sicily, the internal balance that had once held families together had collapsed into open war. In the United States, the structure that had been built decades earlier was now being described out loud in public hearings. This was not a quiet transition year. It was a year where the internal rules failed, the violence expanded, and the state finally began to respond in a coordinated way. The violence in Sicily had been building for years, but in 1963 it reached a level that could not be contained within the mafia itself. The earlier system, controlled through the Sicilian Mafia Commission, had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of escalation. Disputes were meant to be settled through internal agreement, not open war. That system broke down during what became known as the First Mafia War. Families that once coordinated operations began targeting each other directly, and the killings became more aggressive and less controlled. Bombings replaced quiet shootings, and public streets became part of the battlefield. The shift became undeniable with the killing of figures tied directly to leadership structures. Men who once operated with protection from their position were no longer safe. Car bombs were used not just to eliminate targets, but to send a message that the old protections were gone. This was not about discipline anymore. It was about dominance. The use of explosives in populated areas showed that the conflict had moved beyond internal enforcement and into open warfare. That escalation reached a breaking point in June 1963 in Ciaculli. A car bomb discovered by authorities drew police and military personnel to the scene. As they attempted to defuse it, the device exploded, killing 7 officers. The target had been tied to mafia leadership, but the result was something different. The state itself had been hit. This moment, known as the Ciaculli massacre, forced a shift in how the Italian government approached organized crime. What had been treated as a regional or contained issue was now recognized as a national threat. The response to that moment had already been building in the background. For years, proposals had been made to formally investigate the mafia as a system. These efforts were often delayed or blocked. Some politicians dismissed the idea. Others feared the political consequences of exposing connections between crime and public officials. There had been earlier attempts dating back to the late 1940s, especially after violent incidents like the Portella della Ginestra massacre, where labor demonstrators were attacked and the mafia was suspected of involvement. Still, no permanent investigative body had been created. By 1962, under pressure from ongoing violence and political debate, legislation was finally approved to create a national investigative body. That body became the Anti-Mafia Commission, formally established in early 1963. It was not a police unit or a court. It was a bicameral parliamentary commission made up of members from both the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate of the Republic. Its purpose was to study the mafia as a system, not just respond to individual crimes. The powers given to this commission were significant for the time. It could request documents from courts, direct police investigations, and require testimony under legal obligation. Anyone called before it had to tell the truth. It was not just observing. It was gathering evidence, mapping relationships, and trying to understand how organized crime operated across regions and industries. The Commission was also required to report its findings to Parliament, creating a formal record of what had previously been denied or minimized. The timing of its formation mattered. The Commission was created in the middle of an active mafia war. It was not studying a finished problem. It was watching the system break apart in real time. Within months of its formation, the Sciaculi bombing occurred, and the Commission's role shifted from observation to urgency. That attack forced the Italian state into its first coordinated anti-mafia response in the post-war period. Police operations increased, arrests expanded, and the idea of ignoring the mafia as a political issue became harder to maintain. At the same time, the Commission itself faced internal limits. Political pressure influenced who sat on it and how far it could go. Some members were accused of having indirect ties to the same systems they were meant to investigate. There were disputes over how aggressively it should pursue connections between organized crime and political figures. These tensions slowed its progress, and its early years were marked by delays and incomplete conclusions. Still, its existence alone changed the landscape. Organized crime was now a subject of national inquiry, not just local enforcement. The Commission also played a role in shaping new laws. By September 1963, it had already contributed to draft legislation aimed at addressing mafia activity directly. This led to legal changes that allowed authorities to monitor suspects, restrict movement, and track financial assets tied to organized crime. For the first time, the word mafia itself entered Italian law. That shift mattered. It meant the state was no longer pretending the structure did not exist. While Italy was confronting the mafia through investigation and legislation, the United States faced a different kind of exposure. That same year, Joe Valachi testified publicly about the structure of American organized crime. He described the families, the hierarchy, and the existence of a national system known as Cosa Nostra. His testimony confirmed what law enforcement had suspected for years, but had struggled to prove in public. Valachi's statements mirrored what was being uncovered in Italy. Both systems had commissions, both had internal rules, and both relied on secrecy to survive. The difference in 1963 was that secrecy was no longer holding. In Sicily, violence exposed the structure. In the United States, testimony exposed it. In both places, the result was the same. Governments began treating organized crime as an organized system rather than isolated criminal acts. By the end of 1963, the mafia still existed, and in many ways it was still powerful. But the conditions had changed. Internal wars had weakened its control in Sicily. Public testimony had exposed its structure in America, and for the first time, a national body like the Anti-Mafia Commission was actively studying and documenting its operations. The year did not end the mafia. It forced it into a new phase, one where it had to operate under pressure from both within and outside its own ranks. By 1965, organized crime was not in one of its headline years, but that did not mean the structure was quiet. It meant the system was working in the way it preferred to work, through taped conversations, internal promotions, labor rackets, narcotics channels, and private shifts in power that would matter more later than they did in the moment. The public often remembers the years with bodies in the street and Senate hearings on television, but a year like 1965 shows how the underworld actually held itself together. Money moved, titles changed hands, old leaders faded, new ones settled into place, and the next round of violence was prepared in silence. A useful bridge from 1964 into 1965 runs through North Jersey. That was where the DeCavalcante crime family, sometimes called the New Jersey family, was entering a stronger and more profitable phase under Simone "Sam the Plumber" DeCavalcante. Sam DeCavalcante had taken over after the decline and death of Nicholas Delmore, and he moved quickly to expand the family's income and sharpen its structure. He doubled the family's earnings and membership, gave the outfit more discipline, and kept around men who already knew the internal machinery of the family. One of the most important of those men was Louis Larasso. Louis Larasso came out of the De Cavalcante side of organized crime as one of the family's most trusted working administrators. He was not a public glamour figure. He was a functional underworld figure, the kind of man families relied on to carry messages, hold structure, and make sure orders became action. His rise had started years earlier when he was promoted to capo, and after the 1957 Appalachin meeting, where he and Frank Majuri represented the newly recognized New Jersey family, Larasso's standing rose even further. By the time Delmore was gone and Sam de Cavalcante took control, Larasso was in place as a key underboss figure inside the North Jersey rackets. That is why the 1965 federal recordings mattered so much. The year file notes that conversations between Sam de Cavalcante and Louis Larasso were monitored and recorded by federal agents. That sounds simple on paper, but inside organized crime, it meant something larger. It meant the government was no longer only chasing murders, hijackings, or tax cases after the fact. It was listening to the family while business was being discussed. Those discussions centered on illegal gambling operations worth more than $20 million a year, which tells you immediately what kind of scale they were working on. This was not a neighborhood bookmaking corner. This was a family-level gambling system, large enough to support leadership, captains, soldiers, and political relationships. Larasso's importance is clearer when you look at the type of work he was later associated with. He was the kind of man Carlo Gambino's people could use when a favor needed to be done quietly and without confusion. In later years, according to the file, Gambino's side asked the De Cavalcante family for help removing a garbage business associate named Joseph Joey Surprise Fiola, and Larasso was described as the man who lured him into the trap. That later story belongs to another phase of his life, but it shows the standing he had already built. Families did not use uncertain men for jobs that crossed family lines. They used men who were trusted to keep their mouths shut and finish what they started. 1965 also matters because it marks a power adjustment inside the Gambino family. Carlo Gambino learned that his underboss Joseph Biondo had been hiding money from the family. That kind of offense cut to the heart of the system. In organized crime, murder could sometimes be explained away as business, but skimming from the boss was a direct challenge to authority. Gambino responded by demoting Biondo and replacing him with Aniello Delacroce, a former Anastasia loyalist who had built his strength through a street crew working out of the Ravenite social club in Little Italy. This mattered because it showed Gambino tightening his structure and leaning on a man with street credibility, one who could command fear as well as loyalty. Delacroce's rise in 1965 was one of those changes that looked administrative at first, but shaped the next decade. He represented the harder street side of the family, the side that could hold younger crews together and project muscle. Gambino remained the careful strategist, but Delacroce became one of the men through whom the family's authority was physically felt. In years to come, that mattered not just for Gambino's internal control, but for the culture of the family itself, especially among younger men who responded more to force and reputation than to quiet diplomacy. While North Jersey and New York were adjusting internally, the older generation still cast a shadow from places like New Orleans. Silvestro Carollo belonged to an earlier era, but by 1965, he remained a living reminder of how American organized crime had been built city by city. Born in Terracini, Sicily, in 1896, he came to New Orleans as a child and rose through the old Black Hand world until he helped transform that world into a more formal Cosa Nostra family. He acted as street boss from 1922 to 1944, and then as the family boss until his deportation in 1947. His life traced the transition from old immigrant extortion structures into modern organized crime. Carollo's story also shows how deeply these men could survive inside the system. He served prison time, faced a deportation order, had that order delayed during the war, kept running the family through those interruptions, and even after finally being deported, remained active in criminal partnerships tied to men like Lucky Luciano. He came back to the United States, was deported again, was arrested in Italy for swindling and narcotics trafficking, then in 1970 illegally returned once more to New Orleans. By 1965, he was no longer the city's active dominant force, but his career told you what the earlier generation looked like: a blend of politics, narcotics, local business fronts, deportation battles, and long memory. Men like Carollo mattered to a 1965 Chronicle because they were the institutional memory of the underworld. That same year, across the Atlantic, another kind of underworld figure was moving into position. George Cornell was not an American mafioso at all, but a London gangster whose life fit the same broader organized crime pattern of the period. Born George Myers in Stepney in 1927, he built his name through prison terms, street violence, and gang movement in the East End. He began with the Watney Streeters, became associated with the Krays, then changed sides around 1964, and aligned himself with the Richardson gang. By 1965, he had become one of the Richardsons' main enforcers, especially in the tense world of face-to-face meetings and underworld negotiations with the Krays. That shift matters in a 1965 story because it shows what the year really was in many places: a year of positioning. Cornell was not yet the famous victim at the Blind Beggar. In 1965, he was the man becoming that target, a known enforcer, close to Frankie Fraser, used in disputes, and tied directly to one of London's most violent rivalries. He had already done prison time for violent offences, and his criminal history made him exactly the sort of figure whose life would not end in old age. By 1965, the feud lines were already there. The shooting that would make his name famous came later, but the man who was killed in 1966 had already been formed by the time 1965 was underway. That is really what a year like 1965 gives you. Not constant public fireworks, but the deeper mechanics. The DeCavalcante crime family in New Jersey is being overheard while discussing a gambling machine worth millions. Carlo Gambino is cleaning house and strengthening his family by elevating Delacroce. An older generation figure like Carollo still hangs over the national picture as proof of how deep these systems run. In London, George Cornell is shifting alliances and moving toward the point where a gang rivalry will become a murder known around the world. So 1965 was not empty. It was a holding year, a tightening year, a year where taped conversations mattered as much as shootings, and where background figures turned out not to be background at all. Louis Larasso mattered because he was one of the men keeping a rising New Jersey family functional while federal agents listened in. George Cornell mattered because he was already a marked man before the most famous shot was fired. Silvestro Carollo mattered because he represented the older model of power that newer bosses were still inheriting, reshaping, and in some places, abandoning. When you lay the year out that way, 1965 reads less like a gap and more like the point where several later stories quietly lock into place. By 1966, organized crime was no longer just dealing with pressure from police, prosecutors, and newspaper attention. It was also dealing with a deeper problem inside its own structure: the fact that several major criminal worlds were entering transition at the same time. In Chicago, power was being rearranged without a public war. In New York, the Bonanno conflict still had not fully burned itself out. In Hell's Kitchen, the crews around Mickey Spillane and the Coonans were moving from tension into open street violence. And in London, the feud between the Krays and the Richardson side was about to produce one of the most famous gangland murders in British history. The first important shift came in Chicago. Sam Giancana, one of the most recognizable names in the outfit, had just come out of federal prison and almost immediately found himself under new legal pressure. Rather than fight that pressure in the open, he was forced out of the United States and into Mexico. That move did not mean Chicago lost its structure. It meant the outfit did what powerful families usually did when the spotlight got too bright. It reorganized in a way that protected the center. Tony Accardo, who had supposedly eased back from daily leadership, returned to a more active role, but not in a way that put his own name at the front. Samuel Sam Teets Battaglia was placed out front as boss, Fiore Fifi Buccieri was placed as underboss, and Accardo remained the real force behind the system. That arrangement tells you what Chicago still was in 1966, a machine that preferred stability over theater and had enough depth to swap public faces without breaking control. New York, by contrast, was still carrying conflict that had not been settled cleanly. One sign of that came with the murder of Charles Le Cicero, a Colombo family member. He does not stand in history like a headline boss, but deaths like his matter because they show how many mid-level conflicts and personal wars were still running beneath the larger family structure. Organized crime was not only bosses and underbosses, it was also captains, crew members, and men whose disappearance or murder signaled pressure inside specific neighborhoods and crews. By 1966, those smaller killings were part of the atmosphere everywhere. Another New York area development was the imprisonment of New Jersey loan shark Harold K.O. Konigsberg. That kind of case does not sound as dramatic as a public shooting, but it points to something important about the period. Loan sharking remained one of the most durable rackets in the underworld because it tied fear directly to money. Men like Konigsberg lived in the space between street violence and organized finance, making profit from desperation while relying on criminal reputation to enforce repayment. By 1966, these quieter rackets were still as central to organized crime as the murders that drew public attention. The year then moves into Hell's Kitchen, where the early stages of the Coonan-Spillane War were already becoming visible. Mickey Spillane had long been one of the dominant names on the West Side, controlling gambling, labor influence, and neighborhood presence in a way that older gang leaders often did, through local loyalty backed by force. But Jimmy Coonan and his circle represented something younger and less patient. In March, one of Spillane's local associates was abducted from a 10th Avenue bar, taken to Queens, and murdered by a group led by Jimmy and Jackie Coonan. That was not just a killing. It was a notice that the older order in Hell's Kitchen was being challenged by younger men willing to use direct violence to make their point. That same month, Eddie Sullivan appears in the story as part of the same West Side world. By then, he was described as a veteran gunman aligned with Coonan's faction, which means he belonged to that part of the conflict where older criminal experience was being folded into a younger war. He was taken by Spillane gunmen and beaten in the back of the White House bar, another sign that the street war was turning personal and increasingly physical. Then, while Mickey Spillane was visiting gambling operations between 11th and 12th Avenue, Jimmy Coonan ambushed him from a nearby rooftop with a machine gun. Spillane and his men were pinned down, but Coonan ran out of ammunition and fled. That failed hit matters, because it shows how 1966 was not yet the end of Spillane's position, but it was the year his enemies were openly hunting him. The Hell's Kitchen violence kept moving. On April 1st, Jackie Coonan shot and killed a local bartender in Queens and was sent to Sing Sing. Only days later, on April 4th, Eddie Sullivan was involved in an even uglier event. During a drunken confrontation, two men he believed were hitmen, recently hired by Spillane, were taken to a vacant lot near Calvary Cemetery in Queens and shot. One survived, and his testimony helped bring indictments against 4 men, including Sullivan and Coonan. Sullivan received a life sentence, while Coonan accepted a plea bargain and received a shorter term for felonious assault. That part of the year tells you something about the rhythm of organized crime in the mid-1960s. Not every conflict ended with a clean underworld resolution. Sometimes the violence got sloppy, witnesses survived, and the courts stepped in before the street could settle things on its own. The most famous killing of the year, though, came in London. George Cornell was not just another name in a list of dead gangsters. Born George Myers in Stepney in 1927, he came out of East End gang culture and built a criminal life through fights, prison terms, and repeated violence. He had once moved in circles connected to the craze, but by around 1964 he changed sides and aligned himself with the Richardson gang, which made him more than a rival. It made him a visible defector. By 1966, he had become one of the Richardson's enforcers, especially useful in direct meetings with the craze because he had the temperament and reputation for it. He was exactly the kind of man who could not change sides in a violent underworld and expect to grow old. On March 9th, Cornell entered the Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel with his friend Albie Woods. They ordered drinks and sat at the bar. Later that evening, Ronnie Cray came in with associate Ian Barry. Cornell saw him, smiled, and made a sardonic remark. Barry fired warning shots into the ceiling. Ronnie walked up with a 9mm Luger and shot Cornell once in the forehead above the right eye. It was a cold killing, carried out in public, and one that immediately entered underworld legend because it carried the craze style all over it, personal, theatrical, and intended to reinforce fear. Cornell died the next day. His murder became one of the central episodes in the London gang wars and one of the crimes most closely tied to Ronnie Cray's image. Not every famous name in 1966 died from gangland murder. On March 24th, Virginia Hill committed suicide in Salzburg, Austria. Hill had long been associated with the old Chicago and Las Vegas criminal world, especially through her ties to Bugsy Siegel and the money networks around him. By 1966, she belonged more to the fading glamour side of organized crime history than to current power, but her death marked the passing of one of the women most closely tied to the public mythology of the older mob era. The Bonanno family remained unstable through the year. In May, Joseph Bonanno unexpectedly returned to New York and moved to resume control from the side that had been fighting Gaspar de Gregorio for leadership. The earlier Troutman Street ambush against Bill Bonanno had already shown how far that internal war had gone, and Joe Bonanno's return was meant to rally whatever loyalty remained. The Commission, dissatisfied with De Gregorio's inability to impose order, shifted support toward Paul Siaka and Frank Mari as replacement leadership. In other words, the Bonanno War had not really been solved. It was being rearranged by exhaustion, pressure, and shifting recognition from the national leadership. That instability carried one of the year's strangest scenes. On May 17th, after surrendering to federal authorities and appearing at Foley Square, Joe Bonanno went to dine at La Scala in Manhattan with family members and trusted associates. During the meal, Lieutenant Joseph Little Joe Notaro suffered a heart attack and died at the table. It was not a murder, but in the atmosphere of 1960s mafia politics, it still felt like one of those moments that reinforced the sense of a family under siege, where even celebration turned into death. Later in August, Frank Labruzzo, Bonanno's brother-in-law and another close aide, also died, this time from lung cancer. For Bonanno's side, 1966 was not simply about leadership claims. It was also a year of attrition. Chicago saw another smaller but revealing development when labor racketeer Benjamin Stein was arrested in May and sent to prison for 18 months. That matters because it points back to one of the most important truths about organized crime at the time. Even when families were fighting, labor control remained central. Construction, trucking, unions, and local contracts were not glamorous in the public mind, but they were often more important to the underworld than a dozen famous shootings. Then came one of the most revealing meetings of the year, the police raid on La Stella restaurant in Queens on September 22nd. The gathering brought together major figures from New York, Florida, Tampa, and New Orleans, including Carlo Gambino, Tommy Eboli, Joe Colombo, Mike Miranda, Aniello Delacroce, Carlos Marcello, Frank Gagliano, and Santo Trafficante Jr. The meeting became known as the Little Appalachin because it looked like a scaled-down version of the older National Summit model, a gathering where succession, territory, and interfamily arrangements could be discussed in one room. Part of that conversation reportedly involved New Orleans. That is where Silvestro Silver Dollar Sam Carollo becomes relevant again, even though he did not personally dominate the year. Carollo had been one of the foundational bosses of the New Orleans family, a Sicilian-born figure who rose from the Black Hand period into full mafia leadership, ran the family through the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, and left behind not just a record of rackets and narcotics, but a bloodline with expectations. His son, Anthony Carollo, was by 1966 a high-level member of the New Orleans family and believed he deserved more influence and a clearer path to succession under Carlos Marcello. The La Stella discussions, according to the year file, touched on that issue. Anthony wanted more of the family's interests and some recognition of his claim as the son of a former New Orleans power. The commission side supported Marcello and did not hand Anthony the succession, though he was to be given some additional interests. Being the son of Silver Dollar Sam still meant something, but not enough to override Carlos Marcello's active control. By the end of 1966, organized crime still looked strong from the outside, but the year shows just how many separate wars and adjustments were underway at once. Chicago had rebalanced around Ocado. Hell's Kitchen had moved deeper into the violence that would define Jimmy Coonan's rise. The Bonanno family was still trying to survive its own long internal fracture. London had seen one of its most notorious gangland executions. And the national mafia structure in the United States was still meeting, still negotiating, still deciding who would get what, even while police raids and prison sentences kept closing in. That is what 1966 really was, not one single story, but several criminal worlds hardening at once. By 1967, organized crime was moving in two directions at once. Publicly, the underworld still looked powerful, layered, and hard to reach. Privately, more pieces of it were being mapped by informants, prosecutors, and police units that were no longer satisfied with arresting soldiers one at a time. That is what gives 1967 its shape. It was a year where grave sites were uncovered, tax cases landed, rackets were attacked through monopoly charges, and several powerful names either died, were indicted, or were pushed deeper into crisis. The year opened with one of the ugliest reminders of what organized crime left behind after the business was done. In March, federal authorities, working with government informant Harold Konigsberg, uncovered what was described as a mafia graveyard in New Jersey. That discovery told investigators something they already suspected, that murder inside the system was not random and not rare, and that New Jersey had been used as a burial ground for bodies the underworld wanted erased from ordinary police work. It also showed the growing value of informants. By this point, the government was learning that buried bodies, hidden finances, and leadership structures were not going to be exposed by patrol work alone. They needed insiders, and 1967 gave them more than one reason to keep pushing in that direction. Only days later, Chicago gave the year one of its bluntest killings. On March 16th, businessman Alan Rosenberg, who owed a substantial debt to outfit figure Felix Aldericio, was beaten to death by Chicago outfit men. This was not a spectacular machine gun ambush or a public execution in a crowded restaurant. It was a debt killing, the kind that sat near the heart of organized crime, because money enforcement was one of the system's foundations. Aldericio represented the harder Chicago line, a man tied to enforcement and internal discipline at a time when the outfit was still one of the most efficient criminal structures in the country. Rosenberg's death showed how quickly a business dispute could become a murder when the wrong creditor stood behind the demand. Milwaukee moved on a parallel track that same month. On March 22nd, Frank Balistrieri was convicted on 2 counts of tax evasion by a federal jury in Illinois. Balistrieri was not a fringe operator. He had become boss of the Milwaukee crime family in 1961 and had built himself into the dominant organized crime figure in that city, with control over gambling and a reputation strong enough to bring him into disputes with Chicago itself. His conviction in 1967 did not end his influence, but it was part of the pattern shaping the decade. Families that had once relied on silence alone were now being hit through ledgers, income trails, and tax counts, the same method that had worked against earlier bosses and would keep working because it attacked the financial side of power rather than waiting for murder witnesses to appear. Then came one of the best-known thefts of the period. On April 7th, Henry Hill and Thomas D. Simone burglarized an Air France shipment at Kennedy Airport and got away with roughly $420,000. Hill was still a young Lucchese associate at this stage, not yet the cooperator the public would later know. D. Simone was the more dangerous side of that partnership, unpredictable and violent, a man who fit naturally into the kind of crew that treated airports, cargo, and trucking corridors as revenue streams. Airports, trucking, labor access, cargo timing, inside information, and fast disposal of stolen property were all part of the underworld economy. This was not just a burglary. It was a lesson in how the mob used infrastructure the same way it used unions and waterfronts, by learning where the weak points were and turning them into cash. In May, Joseph Bonanno returned to the federal spotlight, this time through narcotics accusations linking Montreal and New York. By then, Bonanno was already one of the most famous names in American organized crime, one of the 5 Families' bosses, and a man whose own family had gone through internal war and commission pressure. Federal authorities now accused him of running an international drug trafficking operation between Montreal, Quebec, and New York City. Whether viewed as a legal move, a strategic pressure point, or part of the government's broader campaign against upper-level organized crime, The accusation showed how narcotics had become harder to separate from top leadership. The old fiction that bosses kept their hands away from the drug trade was becoming less persuasive with every year. June brought another kind of attack, one aimed not at a single man, but at a whole revenue model. Federal authorities charged the Genovese and Gambino families with maintaining a monopoly over garbage carting and waste disposal in Westchester County. The public often focused on bookmaking, hijacking, or murders, but garbage hauling was exactly the kind of industry organized crime preferred: cash-heavy, local, recurring, and dependent on pressure rather than spectacle. Around the same time, on June 23rd, French Corsican boss Antoine Guérini was murdered near Marseille. Guérini had belonged to the older Corsican underworld tradition in southern France, a world deeply tied to dockside power, local protection, and the broader narcotics environment touching the Mediterranean. His killing showed that the same decade of transition underway in the United States was also moving through Europe, where older bosses were being cut down and replaced by harsher or more flexible criminal structures. On July 13th, Thomas Lucchese died at his home in Lido Beach after a long decline in health. Lucchese was one of the defining American mafia bosses of his era, a man who had been a central figure in organized crime for decades and gave his name to the family itself. He belonged to the class of leaders who understood how to blend labor influence, business fronts, political relationships, and underworld discipline without turning themselves into public celebrities. By the time he died, the family had already prepared for transition, and Carmine, Mr. Gribbs Tremonti, who had been selected earlier, stepped in as acting boss. Lucchese's death was not simply a funeral notice. It marked the passing of one of the old-line New York chiefs, and opened the next phase in a family that would keep its strength but move under new hands. The bloodiest New York family event of late 1967 came in Queens on November 10th. Frankie 500 Telleri, along with Thomas and James D'Angelo, was murdered at the Cypress Garden restaurant shortly after defecting from the Bonanno family to the rival Gaspar Di Gregorio faction. That detail explains the killing. Defection inside a mafia war was not treated as personal weakness. It was treated as treason with practical consequences, because every man who switched sides carried contacts, loyalties, earning power, and information with him. The Bonanno conflict had already dragged on through years of internal strain, and this triple murder showed that by late 1967, the family's political dispute was still being settled, the way these things were always finally settled, with bodies. The same day, Johnny Dio was convicted of bankruptcy fraud and later sentenced to prison, another reminder that some of the decade's most durable mob figures were being weakened not only by rivals, but by financial prosecutions. A week later, Vincent Rao, consigliere of the Lucchese family, was convicted of perjury and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Rao represented an older administrative side of the mafia, one of the men whose value came not from public force, but from continuity, internal knowledge, and steady guidance inside a family structure. His conviction mattered because it showed that even after a boss died, the government was still pressing downward through the hierarchy. A family could survive the death of a boss, but when trusted internal figures were also being hit, the whole machine had to keep adjusting. Outside the American mafia world, London gave 1967 one of its most famous gangland deaths. On October 29th, Jack the Hat McVitie was murdered by Reggie Cray. McVitie was not a permanent architect of the Cray Empire, but he had served as an enforcer and freelance operator around their world. His killing became crucial, not only because of its brutality, but because it helped bring about the downfall of the Krays themselves. If George Cornell's murder in 1966 had shown the Krays at their most feared, McVitie's murder in 1967 showed them becoming reckless in a way that the law could finally exploit. Even the year's crime culture reflected the mood. 1967 produced films like Le Samurai, Point Blank, and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. That is not just trivia. It shows how organized crime and criminal professionalism had become part of popular storytelling. At the same moment, real underworld structures were being exposed more aggressively by the state. The screen was turning gangsters into style and myth, while in real life, graveyards were being uncovered, bosses were dying, and family rackets were being turned into federal cases. That contrast is part of what makes 1967 feel like a late-decade crime year. The mythology was growing, just as the pressure was becoming harder to escape. By 1968, the underworld on both sides of the Atlantic was living with the consequences of everything that had broken open earlier in the decade. In the United States, family wars had not fully ended, and leadership disputes still produced disappearances and executions. In Sicily, the first mafia war had already torn through Palermo and driven men into hiding, exile, or prison, yet the legal system still struggled to turn that bloodshed into lasting convictions. The year did not begin with one giant public shock. It moved through a series of killings, vanishments, elections, and verdicts that showed how organized crime could survive pressure by adapting, waiting, and reclaiming ground through politics as easily as through murder. One of the early killings tied the year back to Brooklyn and the Magaddino name. Gaspare Magaddino, described in the year record as a syndicate gunman and the older brother of Buffalo boss Stefano Magaddino, was killed in Brooklyn. Stefano Magaddino was one of the old national mafia figures, a powerful boss whose influence ran through Buffalo and across the border into Canada, and whose name had long been tied to narcotics, discipline, and the older commission order. A killing linked to that family name in 1968 showed how even men attached to long-established power were never fully insulated from retaliation or unfinished business. The old guard still carried prestige, but prestige did not stop bullets. New England gave the year another important underworld death with the murder of Rudolph Marfeo in Providence. Marfeo came out of the Rhode Island mob world, the same environment shaped by Raymond Patriarca and the New England family's control over gambling, loan sharking, and labor-connected income. Providence in those years was not some side market. It was one of the key centers of mafia power in the Northeast outside New York, a city where local politics, neighborhood silence, and organized crime often overlapped. Marfeo's murder belongs in that world, one where local rivalries and family-level enforcement were rarely clean and often left more questions than answers. The Bonanno family brought the year one of its clearest running storylines. By 1968, the Bonanno War had already dragged on for years. Joe Bonanno's position had weakened, rival factions had formed, and the family was still dealing with the aftermath of internal struggle that mixed loyalty, betrayal, and leadership claims. On March 11th, Santos Sam Peroni, a Bonanno family member, trucking company owner, and bodyguard to Bill Bonanno, was killed by Frank Mari, a shooter aligned with the Di Gregorio faction. Peroni was not just a button man in the background. He was a useful and trusted part of Bill Bonanno's side, and his murder showed that the fight inside the family was still active and still personal. Then, on April 1st, the Bonanno conflict produced one of the harsher signs of how unstable factional life had become. Michael Consolo, a veteran Bonanno member who had gone over to the Di Gregorio side, was killed by his own men after speaking cordially to Bill Bonanno outside a Manhattan courthouse. That single moment was read as possible redefection. In a family war, politeness could be treated as treason. Consolo's death showed how paranoid the family had become. Men were no longer being judged only on what they did, but on how they looked while doing it, who they spoke to, and whether anyone thought their loyalty had shifted half an inch. The Bonanno family's internal crisis deepened again in September. Underboss Frank Mari and consigliere Michael Adamo disappeared from Brooklyn and were never seen again. Rumors held that both men had been plotting against boss Paul Siaka and were eliminated once their plans became known. That detail tells you how weak and dangerous the family climate remained. An underboss and a consigliere do not just vanish in a stable organization. Their disappearance points to the kind of family where top officers were still measuring each other as threats, and where survival depended on striking first or hiding better than the next man. Outside the American family wars, 1968 also shows how organized crime kept extending itself through political channels. In Sicily, Salvatore Lima was elected to the Italian parliament. Lima was a politician whose name would later become inseparable from mafia influence in Sicilian and national politics. His rise reflected a truth that had been visible for decades in Sicily. The mafia did not live only through gunmen and bombings. It also lived through elected men, city contracts, favors, public office, and back-channel protection. A mafia-backed political success in 1968 showed that even after the explosions, murders, and crackdowns of the earlier part of the decade, the organizations still knew how to move through institutions, instead of just hiding from them. The biggest Sicilian development of the year came at the end, with the verdict in the trial of the 114 in Catanzaro on December 22nd. This was one of the largest mafia trials of its time, tied directly to crimes from the First Mafia War. Anti-mafia judge Cesare Terranova had pushed the case forward years earlier, and the defendants included major names from the Sicilian world: Salvatore Ciaschiteddu Greco, Angelo La Barbera, Michele Cavataio, Giuseppe Calò, and Luciano Leggio. That alone shows the scale. This was not a case built around one crew or one local murder. It was an effort to put an entire violent chapter of Sicilian Cosa Nostra under judgment. To understand that trial, the audience has to know who some of those names were. Angelo La Barbera had been one of the leading younger bosses in Palermo, aggressive, ambitious, and central to the factional struggles that pushed the Sicilian mafia into open war. Salvatore Greco, known as Ciaschiteddu, was another major Palermo figure, tied to one of the families on the opposing side. Michele Cavataio, later identified as one of the men who manipulated the conflict and helped set factions against each other, was widely associated with the killing that helped ignite the war. Luciano Leggio represented a different but rising kind of Sicilian power, ruthless, provincial in origin, and destined to become one of the most feared names in the island's later mafia history. Tommaso Buscetta, though absent, was also convicted in relation to the kidnapping case tied to the war. The result of that trial told its own story. There were only a few convictions, and many of those were for organized delinquency rather than the bloodiest crimes themselves. Several men were effectively freed by the time already served. Angelo La Barbera received the heaviest sentence, 22 years, for ordering the kidnapping and murder of two rival mafiosi taken off the streets in 1963. Buscetta was sentenced in absentia. Salvatore Greco also received a sentence in absentia. No one was convicted for the Siakuli massacre. After all the dead, all the bombings, all the national outrage, the courtroom outcome still fell far short of a decisive state victory. That legal result says a great deal about 1968. Governments could gather defendants, build large proceedings, and name the violent factions in public. Turning that into lasting punishment was another matter. Witnesses had been threatened, silence still held, and the mafia's ability to outlast a legal wave remained strong. Historians state that this was one of the enduring frustrations of the Sicilian fight in that era. The state could see the structure more clearly than before, but it still could not break it cleanly. The year also closed over the death of Bumpy Johnson, one of the great Harlem underworld names. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had controlled much of Harlem's criminal landscape for years, especially in gambling, narcotics, and protection. He was not a mafia boss in the Italian sense, but he stood at the meeting point between black street power, neighborhood authority, and the broader organized crime world of New York. His death in 1968 marked the passing of one of the old independent Harlem rulers, a figure whose name had long carried weight in the city's criminal memory. So 1968 was not a pause year. It was a year where unfinished family wars kept killing in Brooklyn, where Providence and Brooklyn both produced mob murders, where Sicily showed how political power and criminal power could move together, and where one of the era's biggest mafia trials ended without the kind of closure the state wanted. The story of 1968 is a story of survival through adaptation. Men disappeared, men were shot, politicians rose, judges pushed, and the underworld kept finding ways to remain standing, even after its own wars had filled courtrooms and graveyards. By 1969, organized crime had entered a different kind of phase. The bloodletting of the earlier part of the decade had not disappeared, but in several places it was turning into succession, quiet elimination, and legal survival. In New York, one long family war was finally nearing its end. In Sicily, the old post-Ciaculli pause was breaking apart, and new leadership was rising inside Palermo, while older cases collapsed in court. Far from New York and Palermo, even Japan gave the year a lasting organized crime development with the formation of a Yakuza group that would later grow into one of the strongest affiliates in that world. The Bonanno family opened the year with the last killing of its long internal conflict. On February 5th, Thomas Zumo, a lieutenant aligned with the Di Gregorio faction, was murdered. By that point, the Bananas War had already dragged on for years, splitting loyalties, killing men on both sides, and leaving the family weaker than it had been under Joe Bonanno's earlier rule. Zumo's death closed that chapter in the way these things usually closed, not with a peace conference, but with one more body. Historians state that once a family war runs that long, the ending is usually less about victory than exhaustion. The surviving side inherits the name, the rackets, and the funerals. 9 days later, one of the giants of American organized crime died in prison. Vito Genovese suffered a fatal heart attack on February 14th in a federal prison hospital in Springfield, Missouri, while serving time on narcotics charges. Genovese had been one of the defining mob bosses of his era, a man tied to murder, political ambition, wartime exile in Italy, post-war return, and the long struggle for control of what became the Genovese family. He had helped push Frank Costello aside, tried to dominate the commission order, and carried a reputation for suspicion and brutality that affected every man around him. With his death, leadership passed publicly to Thomas Eboli, though mob sources have long stated that Eboli may have been serving as a front, while Philip Lombardo remained the deeper controlling force in the family structure. That arrangement fit the Genovese style: layered leadership, distance from the spotlight, and a public face placed where prosecutors would look first. Elsewhere in New York, another future development began quietly. Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson, a Gambino associate and childhood friend of John Gotti, agreed to become an FBI informant after the Gambino family failed to support his wife while he was in prison. Johnson was not yet a headline figure to the public, but our records indicate his turn was part of a larger change underway inside organized crime. Families still preached loyalty, silence, and obligation, yet men at the lower and middle levels were increasingly learning that prison could leave them abandoned. That kind of betrayal did not always lead to revenge in the street. Sometimes it led to cooperation, and cooperation would become one of the federal government's most powerful weapons in the years ahead. Across the Atlantic, 1969 also marked a major internal move in Palermo. Giuseppe Pippo Calò became head of the Portanuova clan. Calò would later become one of the most important Sicilian mafia bosses of the following era, deeply tied to money movement, political contact, and the interface between traditional mafia power and the more modern financial side of organized crime. Portanuova was not just another Palermo neighborhood. It was one of the city's historic mafia strongholds, a place where control meant influence inside the capital of Sicilian Cosa Nostra itself. A man like Calò, rising there in 1969, was part of the broader turnover after the First Mafia War, where the survivors, the younger ambitious bosses, and the men best able to navigate violence and court pressure began taking stronger positions. That same Sicilian landscape also produced one of the year's most revealing courtroom outcomes. Luciano Leggio, the Corleonesi boss, went on trial for his role in the earlier mafia war that had followed the murder of Michele Novara. Novara had been the old boss in Corleone, a physician and mafia chief whose authority belonged to an earlier style of rural Sicilian control. Leggio came from a harder generation, rougher, more direct, and more willing to use systematic murder to seize territory and authority. He had ordered Novara's killing years earlier, and built the Corleonesi into a rising force through violence and discipline. Yet in 1969 he was acquitted, and historians state that witness intimidation sat over the case like a second judge in the room. Sicily had seen bombings, massacres, and mass trials, but the courtrooms still bent under fear. Then, in December, came the killing that ended the uneasy calm which had existed in Sicily after the Sciaculi years. On December 10th, Michele Cavataio and 3 of his men were attacked and killed in Palermo in what became known as the Viale Lazio massacre. Cavataio was one of the most dangerous and manipulative figures in the Sicilian underworld, widely identified by later accounts as the man who had helped set the First Mafia War in motion by directing suspicion and violence in ways that served his own ambitions. He was the kind of mafia figure who thrived in confusion, using other men's grudges as his own weapon. The hit squad sent against him included men who would later become infamous in their own right, among them Bernardo Provenzano, Calogero Bagarella, and other soldiers tied to major Sicilian families. Cavataio fought back inside the assault, killing Bagarella and wounding another attacker before Provenzano finished him with submachine gun fire. The Viale Lazio massacre carried weight far beyond the room where it happened. It marked the collapse of the short-lived Sicilian peace that had held after the Sciaculi crackdown and through the trial of the 114. Our records indicate the attack also helped define Provenzano's reputation as a killer inside Cosa Nostra. Men in that world were not raised by speeches or titles alone. They were made through action, survival, and the willingness to step forward when the shooting started. With Cavataio dead, one of the most disruptive figures of the earlier war was gone, and the next Sicilian phase could begin under men who had learned their politics through blood. Organized crime in 1969 was not only mafia, in the Italian-American and Sicilian sense. In Fujinomiya, Shizuoka, Tadamasa Goto formed the Goto-gumi, a yakuza organization that would later grow into one of the most powerful affiliates of the Yamaguchi-gumi. Goto would become one of the most infamous Japanese gang leaders of his era, associated with violence, organization, and later political and international controversy. His appearance in the 1969 timeline shows how the underworld in different countries often moved through similar cycles, local gang structures hardening into disciplined organizations, then attaching themselves to larger national systems. Boston also lost an older organized crime figure that summer. On July 17, Joseph Big Joe L. Lombardo, a Boston consigliere and policy racketeer, died of natural causes. He belonged to the policy and gambling side of the city's criminal life, a side that often sat beneath the louder stories of shootings and gang wars. Men like Lombardo held value in memory, political contact, and quiet management, especially in cities where the rackets had deep roots and old names still carried weight. His death belongs to the same late 60s pattern seen elsewhere, the slow passing of older administrators while younger and harsher figures prepared to inherit the same ground. The year even reflected itself in crime culture. Mario Puzo published The Godfather in 1969, giving popular culture one of its most powerful mafia novels, just as real organized crime was shifting into a new era of informants, layered leadership, and quieter financial power. William S. Burroughs also published The Last Words of Dutch Schultz, another sign that gangland history was becoming literature. At the same time, it was still very much alive in courtrooms and backrooms. That split runs through the whole year. The myth kept growing, and the real underworld kept killing, reorganizing, and waiting for the next opening. By the end of 1969, the old decade closed with several doors shut and several others opening. The Bonanno War had finally reached its last body. Vito Genovese was dead, and the family bearing his name moved under a fresh arrangement. Wilfred Johnson had taken the first step toward becoming one more crack inside the code of silence. In Sicily, Cullo rose, Leggio walked free, and Cavataio died in a burst of gunfire that ended one peace and prepared the next struggle. Historians state that 1969 did not close the book on the old mafia world. It handed that world over to a harder and more secretive phase.